Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Paddy in the studio.
And Laura in the studio. And we will talk about the Prime Minister's trip to Washington, DC, and what was not decided rather than what was decided. But also, I have been delving a bit into things that politicians don't like to say. An informal collection that I've been making over the years, which I know is the Unsayables. So the sort of truths behind the scenes in politics that sometimes are problems that are just too hard to solve, or that successive governments have often not had the space, time, majority, money, or maybe the courage to try and crack.
Basically, the difference between what you'd do if you were building a new house with a blueprint or doing a fixer-upper.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Or indeed, there's quite a lot of, well, you wouldn't start here.
Yeah. If I was going from there, I wouldn't be starting from here. The fabulous expression in politics. Obviously, that's to come. But you hinted at, we'll start with the news, wherever we are in this little studio, the Prime Minister's back on a foreign trip in the heart of the White House.
That's right. Keir Starmer's done a lot of foreign travel,
He has.
actually, and a lot of Kodak moments with world leaders. And he's doing another one tomorrow. He'll be in Italy with Giorgia Meloni, the Italian leader. But he went to the White House, as he told us last week he was going to do, to talk to the president about the Middle East, but particularly about Ukraine, because for weeks there has been a building request from Kyiv, allow us to use long-range missiles into Russia. So weapons that have been provided by the West, lots and lots of aid money has gone to Ukraine. We know that. The West, the UK, the US, other countries have stumped up significant amounts of cash. But the question at this moment in time is, will they allow those weapons to be fired into Russia, not just be used to defend Ukraine on its own soil? Zelensky's repeatedly asking for it. Putin has made clear in the last couple of days, as Steve Rosenberg has brilliantly reported on all week, that it would be a red line for him. Believe that? Who knows? There's obviously a huge debate around that separately. But that's the diplomatic question that is on the table at the moment.
So it's no surprise that they chose not to answer the question.
Yeah.
We had a lot of meetings. We're meeting.
It's all very serious.
Terribly important. And we're meeting, and we're not going to give a statement that we have authorised the use of American, British or French, because you could even see a world where British and French missiles are used and Americans are not.
Indeed.
So complicated to have all these armchair generals been on the news to tell us when a red line is a red line, because, of course, the supplying of tanks was said to have been a red line. Everywhere you've looked, you've seen we, as Western countries in the NATO alliance, have been supporting Ukraine. The question is, who flies the planes, who drives the tanks, who puts the coordinates in? So here's how the Prime Minister summed it up. I think what we can say in a nutshell to newscasters is no decision taken in public.
Well, we've had a long and productive discussion on a number of fronts, including Ukraine, as you'd expect, the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. Talking strategically about tactical decisions. This isn't about a particular decision, and we'll obviously pick up again in UNGA in just a few days' time with a wider group of individuals. But
now he's referring then, UNGA, probably the ugliest acronym in British politics. It's the United Nations General Assembly, which always takes place in the third week of September or thereabouts. As you say, though, Paddy, I think the interesting thing here is that this is a pattern. Will we see it repeat again? So from the beginning, Ukraine have said, give us more arms, give us more money. The West says, it's quite difficult. Oh, yes, here they are. Then give us tanks. We need tanks. It's all quite difficult. Oh, yes, here are some. We saw the same with jets, trading fighter jet pilots. Are we going to see a repeat of that pattern with the long-range missiles eventually being given permission for, which people like Grant Shapps, the former Defence Secretary, Boris Johnson weighing into this, no surprise there, including going again to see President Zelensky? Will we see the West repeat this pattern and grant Zelensky's requests at the UN next week or not? And the wider question around all of this is that when the West, as Zelensky would see it, drags its feet, or as others would see it, takes great care in trying to avoid an escalation, what it does is it leaves the conflict in this status quo where Ukraine has enough support from its Western allies to keep fighting, but not enough to have a chance of pushing the Russians out Meanwhile, Putin can use Western delay as something to make political attacks on Zelensky with.
And not only is he using Western delay, he's using Iranian missiles. They're now said to be sending short-term ballistic missiles. He's already been having drones from Iran. He's had ammunition off the North Koreans. And so we are seeing this massive global crisis over the war in Europe. There's a massive global crisis over the war in the Middle East. And the question for many people who've come through my studio on Radio 4 has been, it's a failure of American leadership, which is why the American election is so important. Who wins that will put a new compass bearing on how those two giant global crises can be addressed by a mixture of diplomacy and also looking Putin in the eye, because the question is, if you don't say no to this man, when will he actually stop moving west? That's one of the big existential questions.
There's no doubt about that. And as you say, it's something we talked about a lot before the election, didn't we? This, what was called by the head of NATO, the axis of authoritarian countries.
Well, you had the head of NATO on, so that you looked them in the eye.
Yeah, and
you've been to Kyiv, you've had the Prime Minister, and you had the head of NATO. So you're better placed than me to put it in a nutshell.
Well, I think it's this idea that there is this group of countries, Russia, North Korea, Iran, who are in various different ways collaborating. Now, it's not a sort of old-fashioned military alliance in that way, but you allude there to that, really chilling thing. Missiles landing in Ukraine that have been made in Tehran. So, of course, you can understand why Zelensky is saying, well, hang on a minute, guys, that's one alliance there. You're meant to be the Western alliance that is looking out for us and standing up with democracy. If those missiles are made by that country and landing in my country, come on, let me fight back.
This is a direct moment of change for the global world order. Whatever order we had 5 years ago is changing now, and it's being changed precisely because Moscow's linking with Tehran, linking with Beijing, linking with North Korea. They're precisely testing the West. They're doing it in the borders of Europe. And Zelensky is saying this is your fight as well as mine. And there we have it, why the armchair generals I've been listening to on the radio and seeing on the TV say, you know what, there probably won't be an announcement, but there will be, it'll be very clear when an Iranian short-range ballistic missile hits Ukraine, and B, when a ballistic missile supplied by the West reaches Russia.
It's interesting, though, to see a new Prime Minister engaging so publicly in this, going out to the White House again. He'd already been there, going to the White House again just before he's going to be at the United Nations General Assembly. He'll be in America in a couple of weeks. And it's not something that people know very much about, or would have known very much about before, or even discussed very much before the election, Keir Starmer's approach to foreign policy. Yes, we spent a long time talking about that global order and how, the pieces are sort of up in the air and Putin's rattling as many sabres as he possibly can. But it's not something that featured much in the election campaign. And yet here we are. We see Keir Starmer spending a lot of time and a lot of face time on foreign policy for the reasons you've just outlined. And it's really interesting. And I think we did, I'm going to sound smug, how appalling to sound smug, but I think we did talk actually about the election and remarking during the campaign we didn't talk about foreign policy very much at all. And yet it might be that goes on to define this government for the reasons that you've outlined, with all of these things going on, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, these huge challenges in the Middle East and beyond.
Newscast from the BBC.
So there we are talking about foreign policy, but all the running at home has been on winter fuel payments, the first, the return to Parliament, the new decisions by the Secretary of State for Health, the Darzi report. There's been an awful lot of not talking about foreign affairs.
There's been lots and lots and lots of activity. And in a funny way, this week I felt actually is when people in government have sort of thought, oh, right, OK, this is what it's like.
It's real.
It's real. And it's really hard, but it's kind of real. And there's, some people I've been talking to in the last couple of weeks have been a bit like, oh, OK, right, this is now how it works. And we have to do this every week. When you get a new job or a new thing, you suddenly think, oh, I have to do this every week or every day or, oh, right, OK. So, and it feels to me like a sort of new routine and pattern is sort of starting to become real. And it has been a busy week in that way. They have had the Darcy report, which has been discussed a lot on Newscast, and we talked about last weekend too. But out of that, alongside that, became banning junk food ads before the watershed. That's a big deal. That's something that health campaigners have talked about for a long, long time. And of course, now the government surviving its vote on winter fuel allowance. No surprise about the vote, because they've got their whopping majority. But it has been a very interesting early skirmish between Keir Starmer and unhappier parts of his party, not least because they, well, I was going to say snuck out. When Labour were in opposition, they would have said that the Tories snuck out the way that they published something yesterday, which was an assessment of how many people will lose their winter fuel allowance in certain categories. And the assessment came out saying around 780,000 pensioners in England and Wales are set to lose their winter fuel allowance because they're not expected to apply for benefits to help them pay it. That's the government's own analysis. That's a lot of people, and they are pressing ahead with this policy.
I mean, the thing as well that strikes me when you look at it all is, has he got the politics of it right? I understand that you can make a case for not paying Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney their winter fuel allowance. I get that argument. And I think you've written this for the website. Politicians have been saying for a long time, this is a blunt instrument to keep people warm. There are better ways to keep people warm. So that's true. So is it really necessary to have gone through 3 weeks of this, 4 weeks of this, for the sake of 1.4 billion? Why couldn't they wrap it in with the budget?
Well, I think the question here is really about the chronology. Is, would it have been better? Might it have been better to, as you say, put it in with the budget, announce it then, and then you can say, look, as we think is very likely, we're going to increase capital gains tax, which is paid by the very wealthiest people, and we're going to fiddle around with people who've got enormous whopping pensions. That's also quite likely. So we're doing that. And by the way, I'm really sorry, what we're going to do is stop better off pensioners getting extra cash. And also, if we're really truthful, the status of pensioners economically has dramatically changed, or has changed significantly since winter fuel allowance was certainly invented. But that's not what happened. It was sticking out there like a sore thumb. And there are, questions about whether it was too clever by half to try to do this sort of flex of the muscle. Look how tough we're going to be this early on. But, the test of that, I think, will be in the months to come, or maybe even in the years to come. Will anyone remember this in 12 months' time? We just don't know that at this point. But it is interesting in the context of saying things out loud that politicians don't often dare to say, is Keir Starmer went there and said people who are really better off shouldn't get winter fuel allowance. And that's something that tons of politicians have been willing to say privately forever and ever and ever and ever. Not that many of them are willing to say it publicly. And Keir Starmer just went there. But it's sort of, it's got me thinking this week, and I've been talking to a lot of people, both in the current administration and in former administrations, people who've had senior jobs as officials, that if you were to say some of the unsayables, that are things that are genuine problems, what would they be?
And you've got a list, I think.
I do have a list. I love a list.
One of the ones, I think, if we start with the NHS, and it's linked to social care.
Correct.
And this was something I remember Boris Johnson doing in a part of his premiership when it was less chaotic, shall we say, was you can't fix the NHS until you fix the cost of people living into old age and effectively dying with the state help, or with the family selling all the silver, all the house.
And Theresa May tried to do it and failed. Previously, George Osborne and David Cameron, for a while, felt like doing it and then balked at the cost. And even Labour looked at doing it. Andy Burnham, remember him? Now the King of the North, as he would describe himself. He tried to do it, and that didn't work out either. But what was interesting this week, and I thought was fascinating, Keir Starmer sat with us last weekend, and newscasters will remember, and he said, I'm going to do the difficult things now. And he stood then on Thursday and said of the Darcy review, I'm going to be bold about the NHS and we have to reform it or it's going to die. And then almost in the next breath, but he said, but social care, we're going to kind of look at that. And in the next, maybe even 10 years, we'll look at that. Now, there are lots of people, as you've said, and tons of politicians and officials who've said to me over the years, you just cannot fix the NHS's core problem if you don't fix social care. The Darcy report said that 13% of people are in hospital because there isn't social care. So hospitals are chock-a-block. They're clogged up with people who can't get the care they need in the community. And that's a massive drain on the health service. So it was interesting that Keir Starmer was willing to sort of go there on winter fuel allowance say that unsayable, get rid of that for millions of pensioners, but not be ready to come forward with a plan of social care, which we should also say Labour did say until very recently that they were going to go ahead with a cap on costs.
Yeah, and also, I mean, interestingly, when you go into hospital, as we've all done to see our elderly relatives, they're often in old wards, they're often in geriatric wards. So when you've got 13% of beds, more than 10 in 100 beds being taken up by people who don't need to be in hospital. They should really be in some other sort of care. That's a huge amount in any one ward. So that's one unsayable. What about an unsayable to do with private health care, for instance? Wes Streeting was on Radio 4 last week saying he would have considered using private health care for his own diagnosis. He had a kidney removed due to cancer treatment. So the increased use of private medicine by the state has also been, we've talked about red lines, used to be a red line for the left.
But now they're going to do it. I mean, this administration has been clear they're going to do it in the way that the Tony Blair did it in the late 2000s under Alan Milburn as health secretary, who is, spotted around Whitehall helping out with Streeting. Yeah, coming back. So the other things that were kept being mentioned to me, also one relating to the older generation, is a triple lock. So the hugely costly guarantee that pensioners will always have their income raising, whether it's at inflation or how earnings are rising. It's hugely costly. And the point that was made repeatedly to me is that while it might be good politics, what it does is it gives the state a price tag that they know is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and proportionately a bigger slice of the pie every year because society is ageing.
Yeah, more old people with the triple lock. So you could means test the triple lock. All very well means testing the winter fuel allowance, but you could means test the triple lock.
But you won't find a politician who'd do that. And I remember...
So it's an unsayable.
It's an unsayable. And I remember, and it's always stuck in my mind because I remember recently so clearly a very senior politician who newscasters will all have heard of said to me privately, well, it's not a good thing for the country, but it's good politics. And then they sort of giggled themselves because they knew, in their view, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, by the way, I'm not saying that any of these are the right things or the wrong things, but they are common themes that are mentioned. In their view, as in lots of politicians' view, that the triple lock is not a policy that is sustainable unless you have a big old think about tax, because basically you've given the state an extra massive cost every year. And if you don't want to be brave about raising loads of extra tax to pay for it, you're going to have a problem. But no one wants to say that out loud.
Well, I mean, this is some of your thinking based on your sources, some of the unsayables. And I'm going to say something which is not based on sources. It's based on listening and reading everything I possibly can. I'm coming round to the view that the budget on October the 30th is going to be historic. I think unless Rachel Reeves, by dint of standing on her feet, she will make history as the first female chancellor.
True.
But unless she goes there to prove that there are more difficult decisions, and unless at the same time she can introduce some things which the public likes, because that is the other part of a budget. If a shrewd chancellor takes all their economic plans and mixes them with the political people, and you come up with white rabbits. But I'm stumbling to the view that that's going to be on a par with our biggest budgets of the last 50 years. It's going to have to be. Otherwise, there's no point being the new Labour administration.
Well, you may well be right. I mean, Gordon Brown's first few budgets were certainly made history. Nigel Lawson's budgets under Thatcher made history. Of course, also, you would say that George Osborne's first emergency budget, and an emergency budget, let's be clear, is a made-up thing, newscasters. It's what people call it when they want it to sound exciting. But this, we expect that this will be a huge moment for this new government. And it's funny you mention that because it's like it might almost fall short if it doesn't have big radical things. But, the people in the Treasury, I've seen a pattern over the years that there's a lot of briefing about how enormous and radical something might be. And then actually what you get, and I love lists, but you sometimes end up with a very, very long list of quite small things that they claim adds up to something completely enormous. But any one measure on their own might actually not work out that way. But, who knows? It's hard for her because she's ruled out so many things. And there are so many cost pressures.
And we're the podcast that predicted the change the fiscal rules first. And we did it with Torsten Bell before he was a candidate, let alone an MP. So this is the podcast, and there are many other podcasts. There's an inflationary pressure on podcast. This is the one that says brace for changes to the fiscal rules, brace for changes to CGT, capital gains tax. Also, I think, employers' contributions on national insurance. These could be seen to be small, say I. She's got to go bigger. So I want it to be known that I now predict, or will resign, that those things are all happening and more and bigger, or there's no point being Rachel Reeves. She's got to go
well,
big.
If she's listening or her team is listening, then I'm sure that they will. They can email in and tell us whether or not Rachel Reeves is going to go hard or go home, I think is the pro. And if you're listening to this, not watching, that was Paddy so impassioned. He was slapping his thigh while he was demanding that Rachel Reeves go big in the budget.
I'm predicting. What is, if he's saying this big stramash over winter fuel is a taste of the difficult decisions. You won't believe how awful the Tories have left it disputed. You won't believe how awful it is. That's just a foretaste. That's just simply the starter on of what's coming on the table.
Well, we'll see. And this expectation management on the budget, they've started very, very, very early. I've never seen a government start so early on the pitch rolling, to use a terrible, terrible bit of Westminster jargon, to prepare us all for what might come in the budget. They started it almost 2 months, or I think indeed 2 months before it's actually going to happen. Shall we, just before we conclude, because mercifully we're nearly at the end, can I bore you with a couple of the other things that are on my list? Because I'm aware that this is a very nerdy creation of mine, this list of unsayables, but I feel better for having got it off my chest and writing this piece for the website, because it's been like on my mind for a long time. Not least because you have politicians saying one thing where the microphone's off and then the microphone goes on and they won't say the things that we know them to believe for political reasons, something like revaluing council tax, for example, which multiple people in the last few days and in the last few years have told me is crackers. It's based on house prices in England and Scotland from 1991. There will be newscasters who are not...
Oh, sorry. No, that's a piece of incorrect.
Did someone actually write that down?
The producer wrote that down.
We'll get BBC Verify on that.
Paddy wasn't alive in 1991. Yeah, sorry. No, I interrupted you. My God, can you imagine evaluating the council tax bans?
Well, I mean, it would be, to use your word from a few minutes ago, a huge stramash. And, someone in government this week said, well, actually, it's kind of strange and wonkish to think that that's a big deal because it wouldn't necessarily raise any extra money from the taxpayer. But if you talk to number crunchers from the IFS, they essentially say it's crackers because it's outdated and property values have changed in different ways in different places. So basically the whole system is distorted. So council tax is another one. University finance is another one. We know there's some institutions sort of on the brink. But who as a politician is going to put on a leaflet, I'll make it harder for you to go to university. But now the sort of what used to be unsayable is you can't necessarily have loads more people going to university and the same level of fees be stuck for years and years and years on end without there being some big problem coming down the track. Someone said to me, look, the whole university finance thing for students and institutions is like a Ponzi scheme. I mean, it doesn't work, but nobody wants to talk about it out loud. It might be something that Bridget Phillipson has to deal with before too long, because there's a perfect case study right now of what happens if politicians successively ignore something that is true. So for years, no politician wanted to say, if you lock up more people in prison...
Popular.
It means you have to build more prisons.
Unpopular.
And what do we have now?
We're releasing them.
Right. And people in government feel very strongly that that is a disgrace. It should never have been allowed to happen. But for political reasons, nobody really wanted to have that debate. So if politicians want to avoid having disasters, maybe some of the things that are currently unsayable might have to be said out loud before too long.
It's a great list, and newscasters will want, I hope, to react, because one of the things is some pensioners who write to me get very upset the way they're talked of.
Absolutely.
Being one blob of people. There's 10 million, and also some, they've worked hard and then their pension is taxed after a lifetime pension. Then there's young people who live on their own who can afford to, saying they could lose the 25% discount for single
on their
person
council tax.
on the
Yeah.
council tax.
Yeah.
Of course, I know that a lot of younger people can't afford to live on their own anyway, but the next raft up are given a 25% discount for living alone. That's said to be under threat. So we wait to see how much we get in reaction to some of the things.
Well, we do. And I'd love to know also, what do you think are things, what would you like politicians to tackle that you don't think they've got the chutzpah to do? And I would emphasise, I am not making a case saying that any of these things should be changed or reformed or done in a particular way, but these are common themes from people I've been speaking to who sit or have sat in the rooms in Downing Street, in the Treasury and elsewhere in government and decided what to do.
Do we go out on cat chat?
Well, we provoked, I was going to say by accident, but that's not really true. We provoked quite a lot of cat chat last weekend. So we revealed the Starmer's new cat is called Prince. We then revealed that Jojo, the Starmer's existing cat, had been killing lots of mice in Downing Street in the flat. We then provoked the ire of Larry, the cat, who wrote on social media that his mousing abilities had been appallingly called into question. Now there is more news about Westminster's cats.
It appears that Larry is photo shy.
You see, I don't believe that.
No, it can't be right. He's always having his photograph taken. Well, someone has said that everyone wanted their picture taken. The new incoming Labour cabinet ministers wanted their picture taken with Larry, and Larry gave them the bum's rush, to use official feline term.
The point is, I think that Larry likes having his picture taken on his own.
Yes, I'm the same, actually.
Are you? You refuse a shot.
No, but there we have it. It's a desperate attempt to encourage people to listen for one more minute, thinking that there'd be new cat news.
And you see, I'm never sure that does actually encourage people to...
No, they've already gone.
They've already gone. Yep. Anyway, we'll be back tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.